Oh, I'm sorry, I did promise. So our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion has created a report on Project 2025 and its implications for social work practice. I was going to, they have not sent me a slide, so I can't put it up here. There is a QR code where you can scan and get a copy of this 2-page report summary. So it is here, but it's also on the registration table outside. So if you want to scan it when you're leaving, or we can pass this around. I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And now really Lane Victorson. Thank you, Lane.
All right, thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Lane Victorson. I am a faculty member here at the School of Social Work, and I work at the Center for Restorative Change, which is led by Dr. Wendy Shia. I think what we're doing here represents a lot of what we want to do at the Center for Restorative Change, which is that we work, which social work has a kind of reputation for. We work at the individual level, trying to remove pain, to be quite honest. But we also work at the systems level, at the structural level, where we try to sort of address maybe some of the causes, the symptoms for that cause the symptoms. We have been actively involved in looking at the elections and looking at voting. There's a movement within the schools of social work called Voting is Social Work to try to really activate and engage faculty, staff, students, anyone, any stakeholder in higher ed to really push out voter registration. We've done that, and for example, this month we held voter registrar trainings like twice a week for about the last 6 or 8 weeks. But as soon as we get past voting, we have to look at some of the issues. We have to look at some of the structural things going on. And so that's kind of what we're here today, is to hear about a couple issues that really involve equity and involve some of the systemic challenges to the situation in Baltimore City, in particular the state of Maryland. And so I'm kind of excited to hear about things like labor and transit. I'd like to introduce the moderator for today. Our moderator is Courtney Fullwood. I will say, as a macro practitioner, Courtney is the kind of student you like to run into. Courtney is the Student Government Association president. And even more fun is Courtney was a community organizer with the One Fair Wage campaign. So Courtney came into in my community organizing class over the summer, we used the One Fair Wage campaign as kind of our practicum. And so Courtney was a huge help for that. So when we were talking about doing this lecture series, I said, you've got to have, as far as a moderator, Courtney would be perfect for that. So without any more, I guess, on that, I'll let Courtney take it away. But anyway, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Lane. There we go. Thank you, Lane. So firstly, I want to talk about why is understanding policy important for students and faculty. I was sitting in an advocacy class this year, and we were discussing different issues that we could advocate for as students. And one of the issues was reproductive rights. So just as for my own edification, I asked the class, who knows what question 1 is on the ballot this November? About 2 people raised their hand. And it struck me that, 1, they haven't done a very good job getting the information out there. In fact, I had just found out about a week or 2 before, and I found out because I saw yard signs in my neighbor's yard. But understanding that changes how and what you would advocate for. Because if you know that it's already on the ballot, you're not going to spend a lot of time trying to advocate for it to get on the ballot. So it's important as students to understand that going forward into our careers, but also in what we choose to do as advocates, and even in our clinical work, understanding what is legal, what is illegal, and how we can treat our clients. As faculty, being able to teach us as students is equally important. But I also would like to introduce our panel here. We have Brian O'Malley and Saru, who is virtual. Good evening.
Evening, glad to be here.
So the first question, and I'm gonna give it to Saru first, is can you explain a little bit about your organization and really what comes into mind when you think about this upcoming election?
Yes, hi, Courtney, Lane, everybody at the University of Maryland. I'm sorry I'm not in person. It is a really incredibly busy time leading up to the election, so I'm all over the country. I lead a national organization called One Fair Wage. We are an organization of 300,000 restaurant and service workers and over 1,000 restaurant owners fighting together to raise wages and end various sub-minimum wages across the country, including and especially the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, which is just $3.63 in Maryland, $2.13 in the United States of America federally. So that is our fight. That is who we are. And part of why I'm so busy leading up to the election is that this is an enormous population that typically doesn't vote, 14 million workers nationally, but we do know from cycle after cycle what motivates them to vote. It's their wages. And so our ability to get people out to the polls in November is all about talking to them about how these elections will impact their wages as the lowest wage workers in America.
Right, so I'm Brian O'Malley. I'm with the Central Maryland Transportation Alliance, which is a advocacy organization based here in Baltimore. And we're a 501c3. We're part of the Baltimore Community Foundation, which is a 501c3. So we don't make endorsements, but we do try to elevate transportation as an issue. So candidates have to tell voters where they stand on transportation, and voters are informed as they go to the ballot. And I would say, looking at the election that's coming up next week, I would speak to it, answer your question in terms of local, state, and federal. At the local level, for local offices, Baltimore City government and county governments, for those of you in Baltimore County or nearby, control the streets. And so they have a lot of control over safety for pedestrians, accessibility for people pushing strollers, pushing carts, or using a wheelchair, that sort of thing. They have a lot of control over how safe it is to be inside or outside a vehicle around our streets, how efficient it is to get across town on a bus. And that affects us differently depending on income and race. And so it's an important equity issue. At the state level, they control the transportation budget, which in Maryland, the state government is the big player in spending on transportation. And the Maryland state government controls the Maryland Transit Administration, which runs the buses, the light rail, the metro subway, the MTA mobility, the MARC commuter train, all the forms of public transportation, or most of the forms of public transportation that we rely on in the Baltimore region. At the federal level, there's a lot of federal funding that flows to states, and the federal government sets both the formulas that send money every year to states, as well as the competitive grant programs which states apply for and compete for. And so you may have followed in the paper, Governor Wes Moore has said, we're going to build the Red Line, which is a light rail project connecting eastern and western sides of Baltimore. To pay for that, Maryland needs to win a federal grant. And in recent years, different administrations have prioritized different types of projects with their federal grant making. And so who we elect president and who we elect in Congress has serious implications for what types of projects will win grant funding. And so that's also on the minds of voters as we look at the election next week.
Thank you. I have a question about transportation in general, Brian. How does transportation relate to social justice and social equity?
Yeah, good question. So when I do transportation advocacy, I encounter people who, I don't know if you've ever heard the term foamer. Has anyone heard the term foamer? A foamer is like a joking term that people in transportation use to talk about someone who get so excited about seeing a certain kind of train that they foam at the mouth. And people describe themselves that way, so I don't think they view it as pejorative, but that's a certain sort of person who's interested in transportation advocacy. And there are a lot of people who care about people and see transportation as rather dry. And I don't fall into either of those categories. I work with and admire people who do, and they're an important part of the work we do. But I see transportation as a powerful shaper of our lives, and that we tend to focus on building transportation to meet demand, and we tend to ignore or overlook how much it shapes our lives once it's built. There's a quote I sometimes use from Winston Churchill after World War II, when they had to rebuild Parliament because it had been bombed. He said, "First we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us." And the idea there is that once we build these things, we don't realize how many ways they shape our lives. And so that shows up in transportation in all kinds of ways: access to jobs, access to education, impacts to public health. Just to give one example, I spoke with, there was a man, Gerald Grimes, who for years ran the Mayor's Office of Employment Development at Mondawmin on the west side of Baltimore. And he told us he trained his employees that whenever a client walked in the door, the first question to ask them, not even before asking them if they have a GED or what career interests they have, was, "Do you own a car?" Because he said that the whole conversation forked based on the answer to that question. A person with a car has access to every job in the Baltimore region within an hour's drive. A person who's relying on public transportation 10 years ago had access to 11% of the jobs in the region, and that number has been going down, sadly, and it's most recently about 8.5% of the jobs in the region. So your whole universe of job opportunities shrinks if you're depending on public transportation, and that's the result of choices that our elected officials make about what projects to invest in, how to design the streets, whether we're designing the streets to move buses or move more cars, et cetera. So that's a huge factor in poverty and a huge factor in people's lives.
Thank you, Brian. I'm going to segue a little bit to Saru here and ask, so understanding how transportation can lead to getting lower paying jobs and things like that. And I can imagine a lot of people are pushed into restaurant service because it is a low wage job, but how are restaurants allowed to get away with paying $3.63 an hour?
Yeah, definitely a lot of intersection with the transportation issues being discussed. So look, the restaurant industry is the largest and fastest growing private sector employer in Baltimore and across the country of young people, people of color, immigrants, formerly incarcerated people, women, pretty much every group. 1 in 10 Americans works in restaurants. 1 in 2 Americans has worked in the industry at some point in their lifetime. It is the #1 fastest growing private sector employer post-pandemic. And yet, despite all the industry's size and its growth, it is the absolute lowest paying employer in Baltimore and across the country. And it has been for generations, dating all the way back to emancipation when the wage structure in the industry was created. So prior to emancipation, waiters in the US, mostly in the Northeast, were white men. They got actual wages, not tips. They went on strike in 1853 for higher wages. And in response, the restaurant industry started looking for cheaper labor. And at first, that was white women. But after emancipation, the restaurant industry hit upon what they felt was the best opportunity for them, which was to hire newly freed Black people, Black women in particular, not pay them anything at all, and force them to live on a new thing that had just come from Europe at the time called a tip. Now, in Europe, for many, many decades, many generations, tipping had been an extra or bonus on top of a wage that aristocrats gave to servants, but always on top of a wage. So, dukes and earls and kings would provide this extra or bonus in the form of a tip to looks like I'm frozen for you. Can you still hear me okay? Can you still hear me okay?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay, great. So aristocrats would give tips to servants always on top of a wage for a job well done. When that idea came to the States, it came right around the time of emancipation, and restaurants used it as a replacement for wages. First time in world history that tips were mutated from being an extra or bonus on top of a wage to becoming the entirety of the wage itself, in order to allow service industries, hospitality, to essentially continue to access free Black labor post-emancipation. And that idea that you could pay a tipped worker nothing, a Black woman in particular, nothing, and she would have to live on nothing but tips, has persisted to this day. We've gone from $0 in 1865 all the way up to $2.13 at the federal level, $3.63 in Maryland. Maryland is now one of 42 states that persists with this legacy of slavery, with a sub-minimum wage that forces a workforce that is still overwhelmingly women of color in Maryland, to put up with the highest rates of both economic instability and sexual harassment of any industry, because they have to tolerate so much from customers to get those tips. Now, things are changing pretty dramatically post-pandemic. With the pandemic, millions of workers have said, I'm done. I can't put up with these wages anymore. I can't live only on tips. Thousands of restaurants have been raising wages to recruit and retain staff. And so we have been winning. We won a full livable wage with tips on top for the first time in US history in Washington, D.C. We won it in Chicago last October. And just 2 months ago, the state of Michigan just became the 8th state in the US and the first state east of the Mississippi, ahead of New York, ahead of Maryland, to end this legacy of slavery and have a full minimum wage with tips on top. So that is why workers have been organizing in Baltimore to get rid of this sub-minimum wage, and Maryland statewide. It is a legacy of slavery. It's a source of ongoing economic instability and sexual harassment, and it really has to go. And just want to say the tie to transportation is that as so many places become gentrified in Maryland and across the country, it's harder and harder for employers to find workers willing and able to live anywhere near the restaurants where they want them to work at a wage of $3.63. And so what does that mean? That means restaurant workers are commuting long distances to work in restaurants where we are, hoping to benefit from their excellent food and service skills. But it means that they have very long commutes. It means that less time for them with their children, with their families. And it means that employers have a harder and harder time finding people willing to work for these wages. And so I think we need both excellent transportation for these workers and a livable wage so that they can afford to pay for that excellent transportation.
Thank you. I have a question for both Saru first and then Brian. How can social workers support your efforts in these two areas?
You want me to start, Courtney? Well, I think you're the best example. I think it's been amazing working with the social work students to do organizing with restaurant workers in Baltimore and in Maryland. So many social work students are restaurant workers while they're in school. And even when you become an actual full-time social worker, it's so important to have you be, you know, referring any low-wage workers that come your way to organizations like ours so that they can get support. We offer free legal support, but also the chance to organize in the workplace to fight any kind of workplace conditions and to fight for higher wages generally. So I think social workers can refer workers to groups like ours. Social workers can encourage workers to get involved in organizing. Social workers can do organizing. We are so willing and able to hire social work graduates to be organizers. So I don't think a degree in social work should necessitate that you do only one kind of a job. A degree in social work can result in you becoming an organizer of low-wage workers, either with a union or a group like ours.
Yeah, I'd piggyback on that and say, I've had a colleague at the Transportation Alliance who was enrolled in the School of Social Work while she was working with us. I want to thank Ruth Farfel, who's a graduate of this school, who put me in touch with Lane and is I think part of the reason I'm here tonight as your guest. Ruth is a 2018 graduate of the School of Social Work, and she now runs Ruth Farfel Consulting, but for a while she worked, and when we met, she worked for the Fund for Educational Excellence and was doing educational advocacy. And in 2020, in September, so a few months into the stay-at-home orders and learning to live under the COVID-19 pandemic, then Governor Larry Hogan announced that MDOT was going to permanently cancel over 20 Baltimore bus routes. And that was something that was a call to action to us. Luckily, a bunch of groups came together and pushed back against that. And before 30 days had passed, they had scrapped those plans. But in the midst of that, the Fund for Educational Excellence came to us and said, we've been doing a series of interviews with Baltimore City Public School students and their families. And these proposed bus cuts are going to eliminate the bus routes that come up the most often in these interviews. This is going to be devastating for kids getting to middle schools and high schools. As you may know, in Baltimore City, for middle schools and high schools, we don't offer yellow bus service. We give them an S-Pass, which allows them to ride the MTA buses. And so if we eliminate MTA bus routes, it will hurt kids trying to get to and from school. So that's an anecdote, but in answer to your question, that's someone who went through the School of Social Work, got involved in educational activism, and saw that transportation decisions were going to hurt the people they were working with. And so got involved with us, as well as a bunch of other advocates, to push back on a policy decision that would have been very harmful to the people they were working with. And so I guess to just tie it back to your question, I'd say that people in social work interface with a lot of our most vulnerable members of our community, and they can see firsthand how transportation is a factor. And oftentimes transportation concerns are just sort of beyond the scope of what someone's doing. We hear that a lot from our partners at city schools. The principal has enough to worry about. And yes, the kids are arriving late to first period on a regular basis, but they don't have enough room on their plate to worry about the MTA and how the kids are getting to school. And so as social workers, if you're working with people who are struggling to get to healthcare, or struggling to get to a job, or struggling to get to school, connect with us. We do a lot of budget analysis and data-oriented things, but we always need storytelling, and we always need people to connect the issue to a first-person story. This affects me, this affects my life in these ways, and that's how we create the change we're trying to see. And so I think social workers are important partners in that effort.
Thank you both. Have another question for both of you, and let Brian answer this first. As you see changes politically, changes in policies and things like that, your successes, how do you expect your organization to evolve with the changes that we're seeing happening in the world today?
Okay, that's a big one. So one thing we need to do as we evolve is figure out how to elevate transportation as an issue. The joke in transportation advocacy is it's very important. It's always number 4 on your top 3 for any elected official. And if we don't intervene, a lot of campaigns for office can go by without transportation coming up. They'll talk about crime, they'll talk about education. Maybe if we're lucky, they'll talk about housing or the economy, but they often don't quite get to transportation. They agree it's important, so we need to get earned media. We need to do events around, candidate forums and candidate questionnaires to get candidates talking about the issue. It's huge. In Maryland state government, it's the number 3 category of spending. After healthcare and education, but it's actually the one over which the governor has a lot more discretion. There's a lot of formulas and rigid rules tied around the way the state government spends on healthcare and education, but the governor has wide latitude on spending on transportation. And that has huge implications for the lives of Marylanders. And so we want to evolve to be better at getting that issue out there in the media, door to door, talking to folks, doing events to connect with folks. I'll leave it at that.
Sorry.
Great. Well, I think the best example of an answer to that question was the pandemic, because we had been doing this work, organizing restaurant workers, fighting to raise wages for 20 years prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic really changed everything. It had been a very hard fight because the National Restaurant Association and the Maryland Restaurant Association are very powerful, moneyed trade lobbies that fight against workers' wages going up. But with the pandemic, on that, if you recall, on that Friday, March 13th, 2020, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. 2/3 told us that in states like Maryland, they couldn't get unemployment insurance because they were told their wages were too low to qualify for benefits. And so they were forced to go back to work before it was safe. UCSF named restaurants the most dangerous place to work. And the CDC named restaurants the most dangerous place for adults to be. And no surprise, 12,000 workers died, minimum. And that is pretty much the same number of workers that died in healthcare facilities during the pandemic. So by far one of the most dangerous jobs, but the only job that couldn't get unemployment insurance because of the wage. Their wage was too low. And so we heard from millions of workers for the first time really in US history that they were done, that the way that they just didn't want to come. Many workers I heard for the first time in my 20 years of organizing say, you know, if the government doesn't recognize that I earn enough, or that if the government says I don't earn enough to get benefits, then probably I don't earn enough and I shouldn't put up with this. I never should have. Can you hear me okay? I know the image is freezing, but you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So, we had been organizing for 20 years. I teach organizing at UC Berkeley, and I always tell the students, when you organize, you do this work on a daily basis and you wait for you have to be ready for these incredible moments of just, I say combustion, moments in which workers kind of reach their limit. And for the first time in my career, you heard workers saying things like, we shouldn't go back unless we get a full livable wage. And, we experienced a moment of historic worker power, unlike anything we've seen in the last 150 years. When 1.2 million workers walk off the job and say, I won't go back unless I get a full livable wage, and then they start to win it. We track thousands of restaurants across the country who are forced to raise wages to recruit and retain staff. When you see that kind of a change happen in a very short period of time, it's historic and you have to take advantage of it. And that's why we decided it was time to go very big. And we launched something called 25 by 250, where we're moving bills and ballot measures in 25 states, including Maryland, by the United States 250th anniversary coming up in 2026. We decided there'll never be a moment like this again, and we have to seize upon this moment and organize around it and push for the biggest possible change to follow the courage of the workers in the marketplace, in the workplace, who are saying enough is enough. We're done, and we won't go back unless we get one fair wage.
Thank you. We're now going to open up questions to the people online and in the audience.
Good afternoon. This is a question about tips and workers. What's the position on saying go to a wage in lieu of tips? Are still encouraging tips, or to say we'd rather have a living wage? If you hear me.
So what we're fighting for right now is that Maryland follow what California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, Alaska, and now Michigan, thanks to our efforts, have all already passed, which is a requirement that all employers pay all workers a full minimum wage with tips on top. If employers want to go beyond that and pay everybody a livable wage and not have tips, we are supportive if that means an increase for workers rather than a decrease. And so the first step has to be a minimum wage. The first step has to be requiring all workers to be paid a minimum wage. After that, if employers choose to do a minimum wage plus tips or a much higher living wage, that is what they call hospitality or gratuities included, or they want to use a service charge, we're agnostic as long as all of it results in an increase for workers rather than a decrease.
In minimum wage that you just mentioned, would that be applicable to all restaurants, including, you know, based on size and whether they're family owned? Because it seems as though there have been some exceptions. As far as what types of business would that be applicable to all business?
So right now, the minimum wage in Maryland, putting aside restaurants, applies to all businesses, you know, regardless of size. And that's what we'd like to see for restaurants as well. We believe all employers should pay their workers a minimum wage with tips on top, no exceptions. And that's how it works in California and the 7 states. That is what actually the Harris Waltz campaign has endorsed as part of their platform. That is what just passed in Michigan. Because the problem with creating exceptions for some employers over others is that that means that those workers in those smaller businesses who often earn less in tips than workers in larger businesses don't end up getting the minimum wage. So we're fighting for what we call one fair wage, a full minimum wage for all workers, regardless of where they work, regardless of who they are, regardless of their conditions. In fact, we would fight to end all exemptions to the minimum wage. Besides the exemption for tipped workers, many states have an exemption for workers with disabilities, and all states have an exemption for incarcerated workers who get a ridiculously low wage because of the exception to the 13th Amendment that allows for slavery in the case of incarceration. We believe in an end to all of those exemptions. We believe there should be one livable minimum wage for everybody who works from their employer with tips on top, no exceptions.
Follow up on that, and I think this would be to both of you, right? So I'm wondering through, you know, who are your allies here, right? There are other workers who might be in a similar situation to the workers that your organization represents specifically, and I'm wondering who are your allies? And Brian had asked the same question for you, especially the way you're talking about transportation as, you know, 4th item on the list. So how does that work? Talk a little bit about maybe allies and coalition building and whoever wants to take whatever order.
Sure.
I'm having a little bit of a hard time hearing, but I think the question is who are our allies? Is that right? So first I did want to clarify that tipped workers are actually not just restaurant workers. They're also nail salon, car wash, hair salon, parking attendants, the wheelchair attendants in the airports. All of those people get a sub minimum wage. And so representatives of all of those workers have joined us in fighting for one fair wage. But beyond that, we work very closely with labor unions, SEIU, the Baltimore AFL, the Maryland AFL, the National AFL-CIO, which is the umbrella of all unions. The Unite Here Local 25 was a big partner in helping us win in Washington, D.C. That's the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union. But we also work very closely with women's organizations, community organizations like Progressive Maryland, racial justice organizations. Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights is a big partner of ours. And National Employment Law Project. So lots of economic justice, racial justice, gender justice organizations, as well as labor unions are our key allies. I'm sorry if I didn't hear the whole question, but I think that's what it was.
Allies for us in transportation advocacy, I mentioned the Fund for Educational Excellence. Others include Disability Rights Maryland is a frequent partner, a long list of environmental organizations, including the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club, the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, Chesapeake Climate Action Network. We're often working in coalition with organizations like those. There's a business campaign called Baltimore's Transit Future, based out of Greater Baltimore Committee and the Greater Washington Partnership, saying that better public transportation options are important for the economic competitiveness of the Baltimore region. So sometimes we're aligned with them. Labor, particularly SEIU 1199 locally, and Amalgamated Transit Union Local 1300, as well as Amalgamated Transit Union Local 689, which is based in the DC region, but we often find common cause for advocating for greater investment in public transportation. So those are a few of the broad categories, but we're small and can't do what we do without working in coalition and with allies and in partnerships. So we do it all the time.
Thank you.
Brian, this question is for you specifically. But I've heard that there are plans to cut the budget, the transportation budget, which, you know, I'm a regular bus rider. I take the bus almost everywhere. And I, you know, as a concerned citizen, what do you think that will look like?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, but I'm sorry, we're that's what we're talking about. But yes, the Maryland Department of Transportation every September 1st or so puts out a draft capital budget covering the next 6 years, although every year they update it and just roll it forward by a year. So this September, they published their budget, and it includes cuts across the board to all of the modes that the Maryland Department of Transportation covers: the State Highway Administration, the Ports Administration, like the Port of Baltimore, aviation, which includes BWI Airport, and the Maryland Transit Administration. And there are $670 million worth of cuts to MTA capital infrastructure. So that's affecting the MTA light rail, the MTA buses, the Metro subway, the MARC commuter train, mobility service, et cetera. And we have pushed back. We've said, you know, I think they're saying things are tough all over. We're cutting everywhere. Although WMATA, the Washington Area Transit Administration, is seeing an increase in its 6-year funding from Maryland's contribution. We contribute alongside Virginia and the District of Columbia to WMATA. But MTA is just under Maryland state government. And there was a hearing a week ago Monday in City Hall, where the MDOT secretary does a meeting in every corner of the state, including Baltimore City, and Baltimore elected officials were asking about that and challenging those cuts. I was there. A lot of advocacy partners were there. We're very concerned that MTA was already cut to the bone. Coming out of 8 years of the Hogan administration, there were no expansion projects. Governor Wes Moore has made headlines saying we're going to build the Red Line, but there's no construction funding for the Red Line in the budget yet. There's a little bit of planning money, but no construction money. So when they come to cut MTA, there's no expansion projects to cut. It's capital needs. It's the maintenance and upkeep of our light rail, which is suffering. You know, on any given day, fewer than half the light rail cars are in service right now. They're out of service because they're old and they're in bad shape. And we need that investment to keep the light rail running. We need the investment to keep the buses operating. It's kind of symbolic, but in the Eastern Bus Division, where they maintain the buses, it's one of our 4 bus divisions. They're having a problem with birds getting in, and they're defecating on the workers. because the building needs upkeep, and this budget cuts funding for the Eastern Bus Division. So it's almost like adding insult to injury on the conditions that the workers are dealing with, they're dealing with. I'm hearing from people who work for the agency that light rail operators are trying to get transferred to the bus division because the light rail trains are breaking down so much. So it's grim. I don't like to be grim just to be dramatic, but it's very dire, and we're at serious risk of seeing the light rail sort of cease function. It's already running 1-car trains when they're supposed to be running 2-car trains, and they're already not running every, well, they say they're running every run that's printed on the schedule, but I'm concerned about that. It doesn't seem like it, and it's been trending. It's a lot worse in 2024 than it was in 2023, and so we're very concerned about the implications of these cuts, and encouraging people to email Governor Moore and ask him to restore funding for the basic capital needs of the MTA.
I'm so concerning about, when you said transportation is always a priority and number 4, I do a lot of research on helping people get back and stay employed. Transportation always, with almost every population, is the biggest barrier to getting good jobs and, which has so many implications for all other social and personal and community issues that we're trying to solve. And just listening to you, it just makes me think about like the only time we really see real investment in transportation is after a tragedy. What you're talking about just is making me think a tragedy is going to happen with this investment that's been going on. And like, what can we do to prevent that? It sounds like, I feel like I could see it when you were talking.
There's work, legislators are talking about trying to raise more revenue for transportation. But there's also a lot we can do with prioritizing the funds we already spend. We spend the 6-year capital program is in the neighborhood of $20 billion. So we're spending billions of dollars every year as a state government on transportation. We spend a lot on widening highways and widening roads. We just did some polling in the spring that voters believe that widening highways relieves congestion in the near term. They believe that it relieves congestion over time. They believe that it's good for public health and that it's good for the environment. And that's factually incorrect, but that's a widely held belief, and it's politically popular to keep widening highways. And we spend a ton of money on it, but it actually creates more traffic than it relieves. And it's harmful to human health and harmful to the environment. So we could make a shift towards investing more in fixing our existing infrastructure, towards investing in walkable, making it safer and more comfortable to walk, making our places accessible. The Americans with Disabilities Act passed in the 1990s, and we have many places, in the MTA system. Last I saw, it was 19% of the bus stops are ADA compliant, and we just carry on leaving the vast majority of stops inaccessible and spending on other things. And of course, when we invest in accessibility of sidewalks and bus stops, everybody benefits, because I won't belabor that, but everyone benefits. And so I would say we could shift our priorities and invest more in public transportation and walkability things, and fix it first, and stretch our dollars farther. There probably does need to be a look at how to raise revenue as well, because inflation in the transportation infrastructure sector goes up faster than inflation generally, and so we need revenues to keep up with those rising costs. But we aren't helping ourselves by investing a lot. And just one more point on this. When we spend vastly more on widening highways than we do on improving public transportation, jobs spread farther and farther out. And that makes it harder to get to jobs if you don't have a car. So we keep making that more challenging for the people, whether they're returning citizens or there's a variety of reasons why people don't have access to a car for every trip. And we act as if that's like 1 or 2% of society, but it's about a third of society that doesn't have access to a car for every trip, either due to income or ability or age. And so we should be shifting our priorities and looking at ways to pay for our transportation needs.
I have a question for you, Saru. What are your 2024 and 2025 goals specifically here in Maryland?
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. Well, we have a bill moving in the Baltimore City Council, introduced by Councilmember Bullock in the Baltimore City Council to raise that ridiculously low wage of $3.63 to a full $15 with tips on top. And beyond that, which we hope to get that done early in the new year because there's a lot of support for it on the City Council. But beyond that, we want to see the state of Maryland act on this issue, and we're actually working with legislators to try to put the issue on the 2026 November ballot because we know how popular the issue is. We know how it, as I mentioned when I started this conversation, how it mobilizes a lot of people who tend not to vote to turn out to vote. Putting it on the November 2026 ballot when the governor is up for reelection, lots of Congress members are up for reelection, a lot of state legislators are up for reelection, could be really important in terms of driving out people who earn the minimum wage or sub-minimum wage to vote for the first time. I will tell you, in this election cycle, 2024, it's been amazing how every single poll of young people, Black voters, Latinx voters, women voters, all have the same issue at the top, which is the cost of living and jobs with living wages. And that has really pushed the presidential candidates to have to be to talk about that, to talk about the cost of living and jobs with living wages. But that fact that people keep prioritizing the cost of living and jobs with living wages doesn't go away November 6th. It's not like it ends after the election. It is still such a top priority for so many Americans, is their ability to pay for transportation, but also rent and food and housing. And so we really believe that cycle after cycle, it will be good for elected officials to focus on this issue and that workers will be motivated to turn out to vote with this on the ballot, which is why we're focused on working with state legislators to put an overall wage increase for the state of Maryland on the November 2026 ballot that would include ending the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. And I just want to share with this Baltimore audience that I think it would be good for you to go to the MIT Living Wage Calculator. It's such an excellent tool to tell you how much is the cost of living in every county in the United States. And if you go there and you look up Maryland and you look at Baltimore City, let's look at Baltimore City, not even Baltimore County. If you look at Baltimore City, one person with 0 children needs $20.43 just to cover the basics of life. That is not taking your children to Disneyland or Disney World or even buying them Christmas gifts. It is just survival. And if you have a child, even if there's 2 working adults, each adult, even if there's only 1 child, would need $35.08 in the city of Baltimore to survive. So Baltimore is not an inexpensive place to live. $15 is not even coming close to working families being able to feed their kids and pay the rent and pay for transportation. And that's why we have to raise the wage closer to a living wage. The bill that we are working with legislators to introduce to put on the November 26th ballot we're starting at $20 an hour. We'd like to see the wage go up to $20 an hour. And that number is moving in a number of states around the country right now.
Thank you. Propose same question to you, Brian. What do you see your goals for this year and next year?
Immediately, we want to see Governor Moore and MDOT revise the draft capital budget that I mentioned to include enough funding for the Maryland Transit Administration to keep up with its state of good repair needs. Those are assets that we inherited from previous generations, and we shouldn't let them continue to deteriorate. And we should be fully aware that a lot of people rely on them. So that's an immediate term one. We are supporting a bill that was introduced in the 2024 Maryland legislative session and is coming back because it didn't quite pass. It passed the House and got passed 2 votes on the Senate floor and ran out of time. So it's coming back, and that's called the Transportation and Climate Alignment Act. And what it says is Maryland already has goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce vehicle miles traveled. There's an executive order. The Climate Solutions Now Act set goals. And we know that transportation is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in Maryland and in the country. But we keep passing budgets that make that problem worse. And so the Alignment Act says we should align our transportation spending with our goals that are already codified. And so looking forward to seeing that pass. We're following similar legislation has been enacted in Colorado and Minnesota, and they're already seeing good results. And we are aware of other states around the country that are also looking at doing that, but want Maryland to be one of the leaders. One other thing that I'll plug that we do every year is we offer a free to participants workshop series called Transportation 101. It's 7 Wednesday nights. So right now we're in the middle of a series. We'll be meeting tomorrow evening. So we do it in the fall, and then we offer it again in the spring every year. And we'll be continuing that in 2025. And the idea there is to create an on-ramp for people who say, I'm passionate about this stuff. How can I get involved? And we offer other ways that aren't so time intensive. But for those who are really passionate, they come to Transportation 101. We've been doing it since 2017. It's such an energizing thing for me and my colleagues. It's a lot of work. We spend a lot of evenings putting it on, but meeting people in the region who care about this stuff and who want to improve it in their communities is really inspiring. And the community of people who go through those workshops is really a fun and dynamic group. And we do alumni events. We have over 250 alumni now. And so we want to keep working on that, keep offering that in 2025 and grow that community of people doing good work in their communities.
You both have mentioned legislation or efforts at the city level, at the state level, and the federal level, right? So it seems that both of these issues, transportation and wages, there's something to do on each of these levels. I'm wondering if you can both share a little bit on the interplay, like what happens if just a city changes its wages, or when a city does, or a state, or how you maybe make some strategic decisions, that interplay between the local, the very local, like the city, the state, and the federal.
Would you like me to start, or would Brian like to go first? Sure. So first of all, not all cities can do what Baltimore can do. Most cities are unfortunately blocked by what's called preemption across the country. Most cities are not able to enact their own minimum wage rules or their own transportation rules or their own housing rules. You know, it's a gift that Baltimore still is able, and many cities in Maryland are able to pass these rules, which is why, you know, people in Baltimore should take full advantage of that and do as much as you can. What we find is that where you are able to pass local legislation, like in Baltimore, it creates momentum for state bills to pass, and state bills are necessary to create federal momentum. You know, of course, congressional legislation is the hardest to pass. especially when you have a divided Congress. Republicans control the House, currently Democrats control the Senate. It makes it very hard to pass anything at the federal level. And so that's why we do things like our 25 state campaign, where we have to get lots and lots and lots of states to do something before we're able to pass something at the federal level. But even doing things at the state level, when you're going up against very powerful moneyed interests who fund candidate campaigns and who, unfortunately, due to Citizens United, which is all of a Supreme Court ruling that allows corporations to, massively fund candidate campaigns. As a result of that, at least in our case, the Restaurant Association wields enormous power over legislators from both parties, Democrats and Republicans. So it's very hard to pass things at the state level, which is why being able to do things at the local level is so helpful. It allows workers the chance to get things done in a local level. Particularly, I think in Baltimore, there's a new opportunity with a new city council coming in to get really great progressive legislation passed that can help us build momentum for statewide wins that ultimately help us build momentum for federal wins. There's another thing to note, which is that Maryland does not allow what 26 states do allow, which is putting these issues directly on the ballot. So in Washington, D.C., we won this by putting the issue of workers' wages, tipped workers' wages, directly on the ballot, and we won it. 75% of voters said yes, these workers should get a minimum wage. That's similar to the amount of support we find among voters in Maryland. In Maryland, you have to get the legislature to refer something to the ballot, whereas in a lot of other states, you can collect signatures as citizens to put something directly on the ballot. You don't have to rely on the legislature to put something on the ballot. So definitely advantages in Maryland in that your cities, unlike most cities, have the right to pass these laws, and disadvantages in that the citizens of Maryland can't decide, we want to put transportation on the ballot or wages on the ballot or housing on the ballot. It's up to the legislature. And unfortunately, a lot of times the legislature is very much influenced by the corporate trade lobbies that fund their campaigns. So those are the things that we always have to think about in local, state, and federal, but each builds momentum towards the final, for us, what would be the biggest thing we want, which is what we're calling a living wage for all, a minimum wage that is closer to the cost of living, like $20 an hour, and ending all sub-minimum wages, not just for tipped workers, but also workers with disabilities, youth, farm workers, and incarcerated workers.
We prioritize state because the state government spends so much on transportation, controls the buses, and trains, and highway building and things. So the state is where we've put most of our focus. We've tried to get involved with or influence local governments primarily because they control the streets, and we've wanted them to own that a little more than they do. The streets, it goes back to that, first we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us quote. I think so often in transportation planning, the governments ignore that side of the coin. They focus on the side of the coin that is, we're just responding to demand, and they ignore the how much what they build shapes outcomes like deaths and injuries and disease, pollution, right? Who breathes pollution, who has access to jobs, who has access to schools, who has access to healthcare. And so we want the local governments to view their control of the streets as a way to influence outcomes for their residents, to make their residents healthier and better able to get to jobs and healthcare and healthy foods and schools and other destinations. And then at the federal level, we've been around since 2007, and we've been very careful not to spend too much time trying to influence the federal level, just because it's so huge and there's so much going on. But March of 2020, I was invited to join a Zoom with public transportation advocates from around the country. And that became the Alliance for Transportation, for Transit Justice. I'm sorry, the Alliance for Transit Justice, and or the Coalition for Transit Justice. When people Saru talked about the impact to workers when the pandemic set in, it also devastated the public transportation industry because so many transit agencies depend on fare box revenue, and people stopped using it for all of a sudden, and so their income cratered, and the whole industry was about to collapse. And so we, as advocates, spoke to our members of Congress. And we would never have been effective just doing that alone in Maryland, but by doing it in coalition with partners in Illinois and New York and California and all these other states, we were able to make a difference. And the American Rescue Plan included funding to save the transit industry. And that Zoom continues to meet weekly to this day. And there's always been something else important to work on together. And so we're too small to take on the federal level stuff alone, but in coalition, it's really important to the outcomes we care about. And so we continue to participate in that coalition and work with our partners around the country to try to influence federal policy on very select items. There's so many bills and so many policies, but we do try to be strategic and pick certain things, and we've had some wins along the way.
Yes.
I just want to share that I live in Howard County, which we don't have much transportation, public transportation. But where I work in a counseling agency that we actually are between the community college and the mall. So we actually have, and my boss is thinking about moving or is going to move. And I asked them, well, are you looking for places close to, close to buses and stuff? Because we are now close to buses, and they weren't even aware that one of my coworkers has to take the bus every morning and every night. So it's just, in Howard County, you don't think about that, but how important that is. And even for our clients, how to get to places. I mean, it takes forever in Howard County to get anywhere, but that's an option. So to take that option away, and people don't even think about public transportation, and being able to be close to it is very interesting.
I know it's not a question, but thanks for that comment. That's really important. And that kind of thing happens all the time, and it's really important to speak up on behalf and to make sure that that's considered when an employer decides to relocate. I'm so grateful. The Baltimore Community Foundation relocated in 2020 and moved to we were already in a pretty transit accessible location, but they moved to an even more transit accessible location. And that's great for us we host those workshops that I mentioned. And it's really important that it's easy for people to get to us by a variety of modes. The Howard County government, the Calvin Ball administration has been increasing every year their investment in bike and pedestrian infrastructure.
Right.
And they've also been very vocal about wanting to be part of the future of the Maryland Transit Administration's planning for the region, even though the footprint of the bus and light rail and metro subway doesn't really extend into Howard County yet. I think they want to change that, and they've used their platform, their opportunities to speak with the MDOT secretary to advocate for the regional public transportation system. And they have the RTA, and they've also worked to change the RTA bus routes to make it easier to transfer from RTA to MTA buses, so that the journey from, say, downtown Columbia to a healthcare facility in Baltimore City, the travel time was cut in half, was an example I saw, because it used to be such a roundabout way to get there. And now you can make that transfer. So they've taken a number of steps to give Howard County residents more options, but there's a lot of work still to be done.
I did have a question. This summer, this is really for both Saru and Brian, but when we were doing the class, we were doing some organizing with restaurant workers, and one worker, I found myself a little bit unable to answer the question because they just simply said, look, what you're proposing, someone's gonna have to pay for. Someone's gonna have to pay for it. And who's gonna pay for it? And the question was a little bit like, who is benefiting from the arrangement now? And so how is that gonna change it? But is it fair to charge patrons, for example, of the hospitality or restaurant industry to then make up for that salary? Was that the only source? And I know, Saru, you talked a little bit about some of the false notions about what's going to happen to the industry when this happens. And I guess for Brian, maybe when you go, just what, back in the old days when some of us who were really pushing for the red line, when the governor who was not from the city, that we had been used to having a governor from the city, sort of was like, your little $50 million red line waste of money, I'm tired of it, and then went and built a bunch more highways. It looked as if, well, okay, that's where the money's coming from, right? I mean, so I guess I'm just sort of wondering, when you look at transportation equity, who's paying for it, who's not paying for it, who should pay for it, maybe in the same way, I don't know.
You want me to start?
Sure.
Look, we've done price comparisons between Maryland, where the wage is $3.63, and California, where the wage is $16 plus tips. And the truth is that especially the chain restaurants that are both in Maryland and California, the prices are actually exactly the same. I encourage you right now to open your phone and look at Denny's in Fresno or Bakersfield or anywhere in Los Angeles and compare the menu prices to Denny's in Maryland, where the wage is 1/5 of what it is in California. It's exactly the same. And why is that? It's because it's not a dollar for dollar you know transfer to consumers. And it certainly doesn't have to be. I mean, employers actually find enormous savings, and I'm sure Brian may speak to the same thing around transportation. There are enormous savings that come from investing in people, in communities. Enormous savings to employers and enormous savings to taxpayers. So let's start with employers. We did a study with, I'm an academic at UC Berkeley. We worked with academics at Cornell and found that you can cut your employee turnover in half paying people a living wage. And that is a huge expense that restaurants don't tend to quantify. That's recruiting, training, rehiring, thousands of workers a year, because our industry has the highest employee turnover of any industry. That's 300% turnover in 1 year. 3 people in one position in 1 year. The turnover is so high because the wages are so low and workers are constantly looking for better opportunities to feed their families and pay the rent. And so that employee turnover can be cut in half, and that turnover costs you as an employer. That turnover can be cut in half when you pay people a stable base wage. What else gets cut or improved or saved? Employee morale goes up. So they're selling food and they're providing better service, selling the food better. Employee theft goes down. Employee morale goes up, and that means turnover goes down. Employees are more invested in the success of the business. So there's less waste, less food waste, and increased upselling. And on top of all of that, and that's just for employers, you don't have to take it from me. The CFO of Denny's actually admitted to shareholders in 2021. I don't know if all of you remember, but President Biden made this issue part of his initial, very first bill that he put forward as the first thing he did as part of his administration in 2021. As part of his COVID relief package, he included the Raise the Wage Act, which would have raised the minimum wage for everybody to $15 an hour and ended some minimum wages for tipped workers, workers with disabilities, and youth. And the National Restaurant Association, led by the likes of Denny's, was fighting that bill so hard in Congress, saying, we'll all go out of business, restaurants will die, prices will go way up. And in that same moment, David Sirota, very famous journalist, caught the CFO of Denny's telling shareholders in an analyst call that Denny's grows faster in California than any state in the United States. Why? He said, it's because when we pay our people $16 plus tips, they then turn around and bring their families to eat at Denny's because they can afford to do so. And Denny's guest receipts are higher and the company grows. So not only is it enormous savings for the employer to pay people more, but incredible new business that comes to restaurants as a result of restaurant workers, who are an enormous population of consumers, being able to eat out more, tip better, and support the industry. That's all for employers. What about for all of us, taxpayers? Well, we calculated that the restaurant industry costs taxpayers $16 billion annually in taxpayer-funded public assistance. That's Medicaid, welfare, food stamps. You know, restaurant workers who work with food have the highest use of food stamps of any population in the United States. They use food stamps at double the rate of other workers, which means the people who feed us can't afford to feed their own families. The people who put food on our table when we eat out can't afford to put food on their own families' tables. And that costs taxpayers billions of dollars annually. And we've quantified how much that is for the average restaurant. The average Olive Garden costs taxpayers $250,000 a year in taxpayer-funded benefits, public assistance. And so there's savings to employers that come from paying people a living wage. There's savings to taxpayers that come from paying people a living wage. And by the way, there's also increased taxes that come from paying people a higher wage because they pay income tax on those higher wages. So everybody benefits, the industry does better, and we do not see dramatically higher wages. Prices, menu prices. In fact, as I said, they're pretty comparable. Now, in the time period that you go from $3 to $15, restaurants might figure out the best way for them to accommodate that price increase is that labor increase, that labor cost increase is a price increase, but it's very, very minimal. We published a report with economists at UC Berkeley called A Dime a Day, which showed that if the wage went up for all workers in the United States from $2.13 an hour to $15, the average consumer would pay a dime a day more in groceries and restaurant prices. And that's because, again, it's not a dollar for dollar transfer from the wage going up to you seeing that on the menu. That one worker is serving multiple consumers. They're probably not moving from restaurant to restaurant. So there's less turnover, there's better savings, there's better food and service, more consumers are coming in, they're eating out more, they're producing for the economy. So it's just not true that you will see this dramatic price increase when workers' wages go up because of the savings that come and the benefits that come from paying people a livable wage.
So I'm just fascinated by this Denny's story. So I'm curious, if Denny's, just as an example, is able to find that in California, its profits are increasing, then why don't these companies just go on ahead and raise the minimum wage in their companies? Is there another reason? Because most companies are motivated by profit, right? So if the profit is there, what's the reason that they are not doing this across the country? I mean, there's nothing to stop Denny's from doing that, right?
Nothing, no. And it's such a good question, and it's one that shareholders of Denny's asked. So after that expose came out and the CFO of Denny's was caught red-handed, in the same moment that the company was fighting 15, telling shareholders, actually, 15 has been good for us in California, the next headline in Newsweek following that story coming out was Denny's shareholders revolt, because a bunch of shareholders of Denny's got together and wrote to the company and said, wait a second, if you're telling us that paying people $15 actually results in the company growing faster, then you fighting it in Congress is going against shareholder interests, which I'm sure all of you know, there's federal law that requires publicly traded corporations to serve the interests of their shareholders. And Denny's, only response as to why they fight it so vitriolically, why all of these chains fight it. All of the chains grow faster in California, not just Denny's. All of the chains grow faster in California than any other state in the US. Why do they fight it? They fight it because of corporate greed. So if you look at, as a publicly traded company, quarterly returns is what they're reporting to shareholders. If you look only at 1 quarter, which is 3 months, you're going to see, a huge cost in paying workers a higher wage. You're not going to see the benefits that accrue if you look at even a 4 to 6 month or even longer time period. All the benefits that I talked about and that Denny sees over the long haul. Their workers eat out more and there's less turnover and they are better employees, and all of the benefits I talked about that Denny sees, you only see over a longer time period, 4 to 5 to 6 months or longer. And so if you are reporting to shareholders only a quarterly profit and loss, and you invest in your workers, you're going to see a loss. And so that's partly what it is. It's partly this system of quarterly returns rather than looking at longer returns. But the real truth of it is that it's corporate greed. They know that paying people more actually is good for them, but they don't want to pay people more in most of the country. They don't want to pay $15 because they feel like it will cut into CEO pay and other top management salaries. And let's keep in mind, these restaurant corporations, we've tracked it. It's about an 800 times differential between what the CEO makes and the restaurant worker makes. And maybe that would go down to 759 times differential if they actually had to pay everybody $15. So it's not about shareholder interests. It's about top management.
Okay, to respond to that one. Red Line canceled June 2015. There was a $900 million federal grant that we were on the verge of, I can show you the line item in the Federal Transit Administration's Capital Investment Grant Program from that year where they had us in there. That was given back and awarded to some other state, who can prove exactly which state, but it went back into the pot and then they made grants to other states. So Maryland didn't get that. About $750 million were programmed for the next 6 years. The total cost of the project was going to be more than that because it was going to go beyond 6 years, but we only programmed 6 years at a time. So those 750 million or so were redistributed to other transportation projects. $0 of that were spent in Baltimore City and a tiny amount, like 10 million or something very small in Baltimore County. So most of it went to other counties in the state for highway projects. There were 2 civil rights complaints filed with the U.S. Department of Transportation Civil Rights Office over that. And they ended up getting a I can't remember the technical term, but a positive finding, this should be looked into further from outgoing Secretary Fox at the end of the Obama administration, but then incoming Secretary Chow, who was the first transportation secretary under Donald Trump, or the only one, threw it out. So that the civil rights complaints didn't go anywhere. And then to your larger question of who pays, yes, Saru predicted that I would talk about this, and I think this is what she was alluding to. There's for example, Eastern Shore Land Conservancy on the Eastern Shore of Maryland just hired a firm called Urban 3 to do an analysis of different transportation spending scenarios for, I think, city of Salisbury, but for a small city on the Eastern Shore. And it showed that car-centric, auto-centric spending is fiscally a loser, whereas investing in mixed-use, walkable type infrastructure generates all kinds of revenue for the local government. so there's a lot of evidence that when we, another example, analysis of the, what was the, under President Obama, the Recovery Act, what was that called? American Recovery Act, all right, yeah. American Recovery Reinvestment Act, all right, okay, thank you. There's been analysis of how those dollars were spent and the return on investment, and there was much more job creation from investment in fixing existing infrastructure than there was on spending on highway expansion. There was also a more job creation from investment in public transportation. And there's lots of analysis that shows that. When we invest in public transportation, when we invest in mixed-use walkable infrastructure like sidewalks, city blocks, there's lots of benefits to local businesses, and that generates revenues for the local governments. So I think that's sort of gets at the who pays. One other aspect of that is there's a debate in Maryland, and I'm sure this happens in other states too, where I think a lot of legislators like to tell their constituents that, like, you're paying more in, and someone else in some other corner of the state is you're subsidizing someone else in another corner of the state. And there's lots of back and forth about that. But I think people often point to how much spending there is in the urban center of the state, the Baltimore City region, and overlook how much revenue is generated here because of all the business activity, because of all the vehicles registered, the fuel sales, all the ways that we generate revenue for transportation. It's the state wants to be treated as one Maryland, and they don't want to share a lot of data that makes it easy to show who's a maker and who's a taker. But the Baltimore region is a economic engine, and so I think we do well to invest in making it easy to get between home and work, connecting labor with employers to make the economic engine of the state continue to generate a lot of revenue for state coffers. So maybe a little abstract, but those are my answers to who pays.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Saru. I'm gonna tie it back to voting for just a second, and it's how important it is. As we have seen tonight, it's very important to get out there and vote. There are very important ballot measures that are on both the state and city, county ballots. For example, in Baltimore City, they're trying to lower the amount of districts on the ballot. It's a ballot measure that's on this year's ballot. We also know in Montgomery County, they're trying to put term limits on the county executive, and like a lot of people don't pay attention to ballot measures. They just go vote for the president. And so understanding how voting is going to impact these issues, transportation, wages, it's very important to get out there and do our part as citizens and vote for the people, but also the measures that are going to help enact the things that we care about. Thank you, Saru, again. Thank you, Brian, everybody.
Thank you.
And if you want to join us, there's some light refreshments in the atrium right outside. And if just remind you, if you're here for the continuing education, kind of make sure that you at the table out there, and folks online. Thank you all for coming, and be on the lookout for future workshops.
Thank you.